Tonight on PrimeTime Politics, a busy day in Kananaskis.
I'd like to welcome everyone here to the most important session of these 2 days.
Mark Carney wraps up his first G7 meeting as Prime Minister and summit host, finding common ground on critical minerals, natural resources, and artificial intelligence, while also showing support for Ukraine and avoiding any trouble with Donald Trump. Coming up, we'll look at what was accomplished in Kananaskis and get an assessment on Mark Carney's performance at the G7. This is PrimeTime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Well, the meeting of the Group of Seven is just wrapping up in Kananaskis, Alberta, the annual summit ending without any great drama to challenge the group's unity, though the U.S. president did leave last night ostensibly to deal with the crisis in the Middle East between Israel and Iran. And as expected, there was no final group communique, which could have proven to be divisive. Instead, we saw more limited statements and bilateral announcements, including more than $4 billion the Prime Minister announced today for Ukraine.
This is our contribution. We'll be working with our European and other allies for their contributions to provide the support. And to be absolutely clear, the support will be unwavering until we get a just peace for Ukraine and Ukrainian people.
The Prime Minister from earlier today. Now, it should be noted at the time of this recording, we are awaiting a further statement of support for Ukraine from Mark Carney, but it's not what many participants wanted. Originally, a joint statement from all G7 leaders was hoped for. CPAC's Andrew Thompson is in Kananaskis covering the G7 summit for us. Andrew, hello.
Hi, Michael.
So listen, let's begin with that statement from the Prime Minister, again to be delivered after this taping. And we know that it's going to be a definitive statement of support for Ukraine, but the statement itself, you know, a bit of a clawback of what was planned. Talk to us about that.
Right, as you say, what was planned was a joint statement, essentially, from all 7 leaders. That's what we've seen at recent G7 summits ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago. This year, that didn't happen. Why? Well, according to a Canadian official, telling reporters today, the reason is that's because the U.S. wanted to water down some of the stronger language in that statement. That official telling us that Americans objected to some of the wording because they are trying to negotiate an end to the war and they don't want to risk that process. Instead, some of the stronger language being agreed to by the other 6 members is expected to come in that chair statement by Mark Carney on behalf of Canada.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know, of course, President Zelensky came to Canada hoping to make an appeal to the full G7, looking for more aid for Ukraine, further sanctions against Russia. But, you know, he wasn't able to do that because Donald Trump, as we said right off top, he left Kananaskis last night. So what was Zelensky able to achieve here?
Well, first we should say that, yes, even though there was no meeting with Donald Trump, Volodymyr Zelensky did sit down with other G7 leaders. And the table did include an American voice. This is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who Trump left to take his place as he returned to Washington. Now, Zelensky looking for more of a commitment, more of a concrete commitment, as you say. And there were some new commitments from Canada. I'll break down that $4 billion you were talking about. There's $2.3 billion in a new loan commitment from Canada. And Mark Carney today also highlighting the $2 billion military aid package that sits before Parliament right now. Here's how the Ukrainian president was reacting as the two met this morning.
Thank you for the military package. It's important for our soldiers to be strong at the battlefield, to stay strong until Russia will be ready for the peace negotiations. We are ready for the peace negotiations, unconditional ceasefire. I think it's very important, but for this we need pressure. And of course I want to speak with Prime Minister today about sanctions, additional sanctions.
And indeed, Canada is boosting its sanctions. Today, the targets include what's known as Russia's shadow fleet. These are ships that try to get around restrictions on trading Russian oil.
So obviously Ukraine playing a big role on the second day of the G7 summit, Andrew. But what else was achieved here, particularly for Canada, as this was Carney's first time hosting this international gathering?
You know, exactly. Mark Carney entering the Prime Minister's office just a few months ago and then thrust into this role in the chair seat here at the G7. So today really was the day where we saw the outcome of Canada's summit priorities and the priorities of the Carney government. There was an agreement, there were some joint statements, I should say, signed to by all the leaders. One involves artificial intelligence. There's another on quantum technology. There's a critical minerals action plan. There's also a Kananaskis wildfire charter of note being signed. But we should also say there were two highlights yesterday when we're talking about Canada's accomplishments. One is the fact that Canada was able to shepherd consensus on getting that joint leader statement on Israel and Iran. And the other development, of course, springs from that meeting between Mark Carney and Donald Trump. That is the news that, according to Canada, the two leaders are working to get a new trade deal done within 30 days.
Okay, Andrew, thank you for that. CPAC's Andrew Thompson in Banff, Alberta, covering the G7. Well, let's continue the conversation now with Senator Peter Harder before joining the upper chamber. He spent 29 years in the federal public service and in that time served as personal representative for the Prime Minister at 3 meetings of what was at the time the G8. Senator Harder, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So, you know, we heard a bit of what has happened in Kananaskis from Andrew, and obviously a very busy 48 hours for the global leaders. But when you hear the Prime Minister speak and you look at the deals and the bilateral agreements that have been accomplished, was this a successful meeting for Canada?
I think it was a very successful meeting for Prime Minister Carney. You say it's 24 hours, but it really was in preparation for the last number of weeks. In fact, he made a number of visits to various countries to prepare for the summit. I say it was successful because, quite frankly, he was able to de-risk some of the tensions that could have disrupted the meetings in advance. His decision to go for statements rather than a communique, and that the agenda of the meeting was, by and large, the priorities that he established along with his counterparts, and they delivered. Having said that, I do think that this is a challenging time for the G7. I say that because I think that the early consensus amongst all G7 as to what the purpose of the G7 isn't as broadly shared as it once was. The United States under President Trump has withdrawn in terms of seeing the G7 as a priority event, and has undermined, I think, in some fashion, the historic focus of this being the liberal, democratic, economic powerhouse of the world coming together. His comments, for example, yesterday saying that too bad that Russia and China weren't there, would suggest that he didn't share the origins, at least, of the G7.
Well, and I think that's a very interesting example you pull up, because starkly we have here the Prime Minister making a very concerted effort to stand with Ukraine. They were hoping for a joint statement on Ukraine, as we said. It had to be stepped back because of the United States. And then, Donald Trump leaves Kananaskis before day one is really complete. After the group photo was taken, he heads back to the United States. Now, of course, there is obviously a conflict happening right now between Israel and Iran, but how much of this is indicative of not only his feelings for the G7, but any multilateral process? Because that doesn't seem to be a process which Donald Trump is particularly enamored with.
I think that President Trump has, both in his last presidency and in the last number of months in this, been much more of a unilateralist, and that has its effect on our bilateral relationships and our multilateral engagement. And we have to recognize that. Now, the skill of Prime Minister Carney was to not have a disruptive event and to take consensus as far as he could on the issues that were relevant and that he could achieve a consensus on. And by the way, they will continue to make a statement on Ukraine that won't include the United States, but I'm sure that, in a sense, the bridge to the next G7 summit is secure, and that wasn't always thought possible
Okay, the bridge to the next G7 summit secure, but I do wonder, and I've asked this of a number of guests I've been speaking to the last few days, as to the relevance of the G7. Is it still relevant? If the United States does not give it the respect that it essentially helped found in the beginning, is it still relevant in this day and age?
That's a very good question, and the G7 has had its ups and downs, the 8 back to 7, and the attention that it's achieved at various summits has been mixed. Having said that, it is still the high table of global multilateralism, and Canada is an appropriate and full standing member of that. But there are other tables that have taken growing importance. The G20, by the way, Canada sought to have the G20 established, so it wasn't against Canada, but we did know that you had to have a series of relationships quite outside of the uniqueness of the G7 in terms of Western economic democracies to include broader representation from other countries. The second point I'd make on this is the G7 has always had an outreach strategy. The day 2 has always been a gathering of heads of government from various parts of the world.
Which you saw this year with India as well as
there was a time when it was often Africa, when we were dealing with AIDS and pandemics and debt relief. Often Africa was involved. China was often there. India has been part of the outreach since 2018, I believe. So the outreach part has always been a feature of the G8, but it is a competitive landscape.
Okay. Well, you know, I hate to say it, we never have enough time, but I do appreciate you coming by and sharing the expertise. Senator Harder, always good to see you. Thank you for this.
Thanks so much.
Well, joining us now is former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy to continue the conversation on the G7. Lloyd, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. Nice to be here.
Now, you are a veteran of these gatherings, and when you look at the competing interests that the Prime Minister had to navigate in Kananaskis, what do you make of Mark Carney's performance chairing his first G7 conference?
Well, I think he did the best under the circumstances, but I think it's time we took a pretty careful look at the G7 itself. I agree with Peter Harder that the G7 is really, I think, diminishing in both influence and in relevance. Let's be honest about it. We can talk about G7 approaching, quote, the Kananaskis charter on what wood fires. Well, what we don't have is a charter saying, what do we do about the use of fossil fuels, which is the reason why we have worldwide outbreaks of these kind of forest fires. The same thing on Ukraine. President Zelensky was specifically invited to find a forum in which the United States president would be part of a collaborative group. And of course, it seems Donald Trump can't stay any more than 24 hours at any meeting in Canada. And all of a sudden, the Ukraine commitment, which is absolutely essential, the G7 was basically neutered on this. I think Mr. Carney, I think, was dealt a pretty weak deck to begin with, because anything that Donald Trump is involved in is clearly something that has all the potential of risk and damage, and of course it has. So I think I really prefer us to be realistic and honest about appraisal and realize why the G7 seems to be prestigious is increasingly losing its effectiveness in actually initiating actions to solve world problems in a collaborative way.
Okay, let me jump in there. You know, you say decreasing in its capacity, but is that a function of this one president? Because we know that Donald Trump does not like multilateral efforts. Is that because of this one president, or do you think this is basically the dying days of an organization that, you know, just marked its 50th gathering here in Canada?
Look, I mean, there's an old saying about the old order is dying, the new one hasn't been born. I think we're seeing a lot of the disappearance or the really shakedown of institutions that we've honored and that we felt useful. But it's time to start thinking of some new ones. And how do we redesign our system to take into account of? I mean, Donald Trump is not going away. He's around for another 3 years. Are we going to have another 3 years of G7s and the kind of parody that goes on in these things? Or are we going to, stand up and take some stands on this? I think, for example, the G7 has made a mistake in the past of not adding some new members from the global south, Korea, Brazil, Australia, who were democratic societies and could actually bring to the table a different kind of a voice. I think the only way to deal with Mr. Trump is to simply drown him out and have enough countries who have the will and the resources to provide alternatives to U.S. policy. Otherwise, we're going to be living in a world in which the kind of mendacity of Donald Trump is going to be triumphant.
You say a different voice, and I'm going to move on from Donald Trump here because there was several voices heard, as we heard from Senator Harder. Day two oftentimes is dedicated to inviting leaders not part of the G7 list of countries, and one of the leaders invited this year was, of course, the Prime Minister of India. And I'm going to read to you here a bit of the joint statement that was released after the bilateral meeting. It just wrapped up in this last half hour between the Prime Minister of Canada and India. The statement says, Prime Minister Carney and Prime Minister Modi importance of Canada-India ties based upon mutual respect, the rule of law, and a commitment to the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity. The leaders agreed to designate new high commissioners with a view to returning to regular services to citizens and businesses in both countries. Again, that was the joint statement just issued in the last half hour or so, Mr. Axworthy. But the Prime Minister was criticized for inviting the Prime Minister of India to Alberta. Did Canada lose any moral high ground by including Narendra Modi in this meeting?
Well, it lost it with the Sikh community, who feel very strongly about the what they see as the persecution of Mr. Modi's government. But I agree the importance of having a meeting with them and trying to reestablish some contact. I think that makes good sense. But the communique, once again, didn't deal with the real issues. The real issues are that there's a fundamental question about the Khalistan movement, who were considered to be terrorists in India and considered to be sort of logical and important members of the Canadian identity. I think it's time to be just a little bit more open and left bafflegab. But I think it's another example, Michael. I'm not trying to be harsh, but I'm glad that they had the meeting, and I'm glad that there is an effort to start putting in place some proper connections. But to claim that this is sort of coming to grips with the fundamental issues between Canada and India remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Sikh community here, and I do want to point out the fact that this was not agreed to, but in terms of the Indian Prime Minister saying this. But as I go on to the statement, it says Mark Carney did raise priorities on the G7 agenda, including transnational crime and repression, security, and rules-based order. I'm wondering if that is some way to address some of the criticisms that have been lodged at the Prime Minister for inviting Prime Minister Modi.
Well, here's an angle, Michael. We had an election in which the Canadian public made very clear they want a more independent strategy in defense and trade and other things. We hear from Mr. Trump on the way back to Washington that Canada wants to join this Golden Dome. Golden Dome is actually a better word. And it's only going to cost us a mere $71 billion. I think Mr. Carney has to clear the air on this issue. Are we actually negotiating to join this kind of fantasy proposal of Mr. Trump, which is going to cost billions of dollars, suck money away from the real defense security issues we have, and actually probably generate a new kind of arms race in space? I think that I think Canadians, and I think Parliament in particular, is owed that kind of explanation.
owed an explanation, although, you know, I have to say I was thinking about you today when we were hearing from Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, because we did hear from her during this meeting, essentially confirming what has been talked about here in Ottawa, speculated, if you will, that in a matter of days, Canada will sign an agreement that deepens military and security ties with Europe. But you and I have talked in the past. You've expressed concern about Canada being too close to the U.S., particularly in light of comments made by Donald Trump about annexation. What do you think of this move by the Carney government to get to essentially reinvigorate the alliance with Europe?
I think it's a good one, but how do you fit that commitment with the kind of commitment that seems to be alive, or at least under discussion, to entangle ourselves even more deeply with the U.S. military systems? I mean, is it simply a contradiction, or is Mr. Trump not telling the truth? Well, I mean, that's quite a possibility. He's a well-known liar. But I think we shouldn't be having these discussions so much behind the closed doors. I think it's time that Parliament be brought into the discussion, the Canadians be brought into the discussion. And I think moving with Europe, but again, I think there are things that we have to do more independently ourselves. I think the Arctic is an area where Canada has to take special responsibility and work with Denmark and Greenland and the other the Nordic countries to make sure it doesn't become a playground for the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans. These are things that I think we have to toughen up in terms of what we're prepared to do. And, you know, diplomatic language doesn't always have to be simply a form of flattery or occasion. I think Canadian people gave Mr. Carney a very strong mandate to take a very strong independent line for Canada.
Mm-hmm. Given this mandate, but you know, and I hear what you're saying about the public statements and the joint statements that we're getting out of the G7. But you know, as I said, you've been a part of these meetings. You've been a part of several international meetings, and obviously there are closed-door conversations. And if Canada is looking to build relationships beyond the United States, which you know we've seen movements towards that, how important was the FaceTime at Kananaskis? I appreciate what you're saying about the G7 perhaps needing to have more teeth, but behind closed doors, do you think something was accomplished there? How important are those face-to-face meetings for the Prime Minister?
Well, they potentially are important. I mean, that's the place where you establish good relationships, where you get to know each other and you can share ideas and thoughts about it. And I hope that's what happened. We certainly need to do that. But the soup will be in the telling and the eating. Does this result in Canada taking more independent status? Are we actually, what kind of procurement are we going to do? Are we going to sort of cancel the F-35? Are we going to buy a Swedish plane? Are we going to stop using the black boxes in our destroyers and ships and planes that come to us from the United States? People are really looking for a different signal. And right now I have to say that it's become increasingly more muted. And maybe that's just good politics, but sometimes good politics is not strong politics. Let me say, for example, if I have one disappointment, Michael, about this, it's about Ukraine. President Zelensky was invited specifically so that the G7 could establish a much stronger set of supports, sanctions, identification of ghost ships, and even the Canadian idea that was at the G7 last year to release frozen assets, Russian assets that are frozen, in order to get Ukraine to help pay for the damage and the destruction that's going on. This wasn't on the agenda at this meeting. It was taken off because some Europeans didn't like it, the Americans didn't like it, and so here was something that was a very significant move at the last G7, should have been followed up here, but it wasn't even talked about.
Mm-hmm. You know, as I listen to you speak, Mr. Axworthy, I wonder how final this judgment is, because, and I touched upon it before, but maybe we can dig in a bit deeper, because, you know, President Trump is currently the U.S. president. This will not always be the case. Is it because you believe essentially the United States, this withdrawal or this hesitancy that we're seeing from the Trump administration will be a permanent marker of our relationship with the U.S. going forward?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's a fundamental belief or trust in the relationship with the U.S. has been broken. Over half of of Americans voted for Donald Trump, and there's still his approval ratings with the right wing. He is still, and he will be president. And after whom comes J.D. Vance, who would be, a kind of a mini me, Donald Trump. That particular political movements in the United States, which is taking over their institutions, their law systems, their universities, the State Department withdrawing from any commitments, those are hard to repair. I mean, the damage that's happening right today in Africa on health issues for children and women, vulnerable people, is immense. And I think the same thing, the kind of work I do, Michael, on refugees, the withdrawal of any support for refugees is again having a horrible sort of impact upon people. If the G7 really had a kind of a little sharp end to the spear, it should have been addressing these issues, but they weren't, because those are not issues that would keep Mr. Trump happy. And so we had some good conversations. That's a plus. I think that there's been some releases, but no strong issues on the tough issues, such as how do we make sure that Ukraine is not overwhelmed by the Russian aggression? That, to me, is an issue at the center of our international politics right now.
Forgive me for jumping in, but I have about a minute left with you, Mr. Axworthy. The next G7 is scheduled for France next year. Should Canada participate in that?
I think what Canada should do is be putting some proposals out as we start negotiating, saying, how do we make this system work? I mean, as Peter Harder said, it's based upon what we consider a common ethos. Well, that common ethos is not shared by Mr. Trump. So how do you cope with that? That's a serious issue. In order to revive and revitalize the G7 and give it new life, I think we have to do more than just sort of say, okay, it's happening a year from now. Let's repeat the same old sort of minuet again. I think there's an opportunity for Canada to show some leadership here.
Lloyd Axworthy, always appreciate the time, especially your thoughts as the G7 wraps up meeting in Kananaskis. You take care.
Right. You have the same. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. And that is the former Foreign Affairs Minister, Lloyd Axworthy. Well, that is our program for you on this Tuesday as we wrap up our coverage of the G7 in Alberta. I'm Michael Serapio. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.